and that's about leading through service. Maybe many of you may already be familiar with servant leadership. Some of you may know more about than I do, but I thought it'd be good to give you an overview about this, and also give you a reference of something if you'd like to learn more. Certainly, this is not going to be a complete and exhaustive discussion about servant leadership. I think it's a form of leadership that's especially relevant for us. I think it's relevant everywhere, but it's relevant here. We're dealing with volunteers, and because so much of what we do is service anyway. So it makes sense that our leadership should be based on service, just as our work in ARES is based on service. But not everybody may find this attractive, and so you're welcome to go away. If you're looking for personal fame and fortune, if you want your ego stroked, if you're looking for some quick and dirty leadership shortcuts, some quick fixes, then this conversation is not probably for you, and you might as well do something else with your time, because this will not be what I'll be talking about. On the other hand, I think you definitely want to get involved with this. I think this is the best way to serve ARES. It's an optimal leadership for ARES. It's a source of authentic leadership. It has a lot of challenges, but a lot of rewards. It has great results. It's a great chance for personal development, everybody's full potential, both the people we work with and what we do. And it also is about humble, relentless, and committed leadership. So here are the topics that I will be covering. Give a little background on servant leadership, tell you about its characteristics. There are some paradoxes associated with servant leadership, which are interesting. Even to many, the name itself, servant and leadership, seem like they're contradictory. And so that's a kind of a paradox, I suppose. Talk about its practice, give you some examples, then give you a place to go for more information. So that's going to be our path. Let's start with the background. We're going to try to define servant leadership, give you a brief overview of its history as a concept. It's really it's a concept that goes back earliest in human history, goes back for thousands of years. As you can see, it has its roots in lots of cultures, in lots of different religious and secular origins, going back to probably even further than 600 BC. In the modern day, the 1970s, Robert Greenleaf, I would identify him as the secular servant leadership founder or guru. And he was an executive with AT&T who, and Elderly Park, kind of looked back and said, there's a better way to do things. And he began thinking about this and organizing this. And he is famous for his discussion of leadership as being, first you start as a servant, that it begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. But that's got to be the premise. You don't say, I'm going to be a leader, and then hunt around and say, I'll do that by serving. You begin by being somebody who serves to begin with. There are a lot of people in time who have professed things that are very consistent with servant leadership. And I think for a lot of people, servant leadership resonates very well with kind of how you were brought up and with the various ideas and principles that are familiar and are comfortable for people. The term servant has a lot of definitions. It can mean talk about service of another, submission, debt to another, subordinate position, working for another. It's often viewed as not being selfish, but extending yourself, which I mean doing more than just what you would do for yourself, and making sacrifices for another. That's what a servant does. It's not the same as being a slave. A slave does things that someone wants. You're there for every wish. A servant is someone who identifies and meets what someone needs. That's a very important distinction between wants and needs. So when we talk about servant leadership, we're talking about people's needs, but not their wants. Sometimes, especially with children, those of you who have children are probably familiar with this, they're very quick, and they figure out that the word want isn't a very good word, so they change it to need. I need a new video game. I need to go to this movie. I see some people nodding, and I've seen this process. This need, of course, is more fundamental. And as a parent, you've already had to separate those things and say, I get that's what you want. That may not be what you need. In fact, oftentimes what people say they want is not what they need. They need the reverse of that. But that's one of the things a leader is doing this is has to talk about. When we talk about service, it's an act of assistance or benefit, help and aid. You're helpful, you're useful. I'm not sure I always like the word help. It's kind of a four-letter word, but I like the idea of being useful to people. Helping to me suggests a certain subordination, that I'm better than they are and I'm helping them, but being useful to them is a whole different process. So I often try to remember to use the term useful as opposed to the word help. I'm probably unique in this way, but when I go to a store and somebody says, "May I help you?" I kind of cringe and often kind of retract and kind of go, "No, you can't help me." But if somebody says, "Hey, you need this, or could this be useful to you?" That's a different proposition. That may be just my reaction to that. Another important set of terminology here is manager and leader. People often use these terms interchangeably, but they really have a sense of a different thing. A manager is somebody who manages things, and a leader is someone who leads people. And I'm sure you can already imagine that somebody who thinks about their job as a manager of people has already made people into things. And we see that unfortunately all too often in lots of parts of life, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Is we want to treat people and as human beings as we are. Another distinction is between power and authority. So power is the ability to force or coerce someone to do your will, even if they choose not to because of your position or might. The neatest way to summarize power is to do it or else. Again, those of you who are parents, you've probably uttered words like that before, but you are exercising power. I'm going to do a slight break here because this is often a hiccup for a lot of people. We have come in our society to use incentives a lot we call it motivate people. I call it manipulate people. And then we also use penalties. And sometimes we think incentives are better than penalties. In a servant leadership context, they're really the same thing. They're equivalent. They're all ways of saying do it or else. Do this or else you won't get this benefit, or do this or else you will get this punishment. Either way, you're using a form of power. You're coercing somebody, manipulating somebody to do something they don't want to do. And that puts you in a different relationship with them. It actually erodes your relationship with them. And I know, I'm guessing, again, maybe it's unique to me, but when people have done this, I tend to lose my connection to someone when they try to make this move on me and they try to buy me or they try to punish me. I was a very difficult child, by the way, as you probably all could imagine. And when I was younger, I really resisted when my parents would try to either throw penalties at me or even try to incent me to do things. Either way, I saw my independence and freedom being compromised. And they didn't appreciate that. They thought if I would do anything for a toy, and it turns out I wouldn't. And it really upset them, actually. But this is a pretty interesting kind of a thing. I would suggest to you, there's a lot of research on this going back to the 50s that says that actually using incentives to get people to do things is actually very bad for performance. It's not only it's not effective, it actually hurts performance. And so I'll let you look this up on your own. There's a gentleman by the name of Daniel Pink that wrote a book called Drive that talks about this. There's also a very good, relatively short video, about 10 or 15 minutes, you can find online. If anybody can't find it, I'd be glad to provide you the link. But it summarizes this kind of surprising result that using incentives causes people to do less work and to get less done and to be less creative. I actually don't find that that's surprising because, again, there are a lot of reasons for it. It's especially bad, I think, in a volunteer situation. What does motivate people, in case you're wondering, so I filled this gap for you, I don't just simply tear something down. There are three things that the research, again, over 70 years, repeatedly shows to be the case. What motivates people, and I think it applies to us equally well, are three things. The first is autonomy. We like to do things which we can make our mark, where we can make a difference. And I just think about in amateur radio, how we have such dismissal for appliance operators who plug in a piece of equipment and operate it. We don't think of that as being very worthy. We think instead of people who either build their own stuff or customize it, or at least know it well enough to have some idea of what it's doing, and that's a case of autonomy. They're not at the mercy of the manufacturer. Unfortunately, modern technology has taken a lot of our autonomy away from us. When I got started in amateur radio in the 1960s, you could take a toilet paper tube and wrap it with wire and a few other discrete components and build yourself a transmitter or build yourself a receiver, and there's a lot of opportunity for you to be right there in the middle of the whole thing. In those days, we could also get into an automobile and you could tune it yourself and you could find things. Now everything is just bonded in epoxy or in some microscopic chip, and we don't have a way of knowing much of what's going on. And I don't know about you guys, I hate to sound like an old curmudgeon, but the hobby is not quite as much fun as it used to be because you just don't get a chance to see everything and work with everything down to that level. Of course, you can still do it yourself in many ways, but it's often kind of silly because it's so much easier for people using manufacturing to make circuit boards and using integrated circuits and things like that. But anyway, that's what motivates people is autonomy. The second is mastery. And again, we see this in amateur radio, I think, a lot. Mastery means to get better at things, to see yourself improving. And that's another major source of encouragement for people, things that make people happy. There are organizations out there that have very structured forms of mastery. If any of you was a Boy Scout, you know that you work your way through the various ranks, you do various things, and you don't get rewarded, you get recognized. Fair enough, a distinction. But then again, it's about your dignity and saying, I actually did this and I got better at doing things. And then the final thing is a transcendent purpose. That's the third big motivator. It's doing something that's bigger than yourself. And again, I think in a lot of arenas, one of the reasons why we're involved in ARES and not instead just messing around is because we want to do something that's bigger than ourselves. We want to serve our community. We want to be there when things happen. So that's the transcendent purpose, and that's the part that people get excited and are willing to even die for an appropriate transcendent purpose, more than they will die for their benefits or for a bonus or things like that. So there's more to look. That could be a whole presentation by itself, but that's one place where people often, I lose people when I talk about incentives are actually a bad thing. The problem with incentives and the use of power is that it actually erodes, one big problem is that it erodes relationships. Another problem with power comes from something external to yourself. You get power because of your title, because somebody appointed you something. I don't know that I have any power, but I'm a coordinator for West Central because Wayne appointed me. It did not come from me. It's nothing that I did. It's because he has blessed me. And as a result, it's like a battery. Every time I use it, as if I could, but if I did, it would start running down. And I have no way of recharging it, really. On the other hand, authority is something where you build your personal influence. And because people will willingly serve the common good because of your influence. And you gain influence. Again, we see this all the time in our hobby. You gain influence because you're competent, because you're dedicated, because you're reliable, you're trustworthy, you're caring, you are honest, a bunch of things that make you somebody worthy of having influence. And I'm guessing if I gave him a chance, Wayne could talk for about an hour about the National Guard and how leadership works and how the bars on your shoulders get you about 10 seconds maybe of something. And if that's all you rely on, you're probably going to get shot in the back. Or bad things will happen if you're trying to keep saying, I'm an officer, do what I say. You have to earn it all the time by being somebody that other people respect, and they follow you. They do it willingly because they know you're working for the same thing and you're worthy of being followed. You have the right stuff. And that actually builds relationships. Unlike eroding relationships with power, authority and influence are things that give you tighter relationships. For me, and so the reason I'm spending so much time on this is that in servant leadership, this is one of the things I use as a test for whether something is the right thing to do. Is does this, after this is done, did that build relationships or did that hurt relationships? Because I would contend, so this is the definition of leadership in the servant leadership uses. It's the skill of influencing people to work enthusiastically toward goals identifying as beings for the common good, with character that inspire confidence. One big word here, and that's why it's in bold and italics, is the word skill. As far as we know, there's no leadership gene. Nobody inherits the ability to be a good leader. There are some attributes that make people better leaders than others, but nobody is a born leader. It has to develop. And plenty of people who are not particularly great leaders initially develop themselves into being better leaders by adopting the right kinds of things. You can think of a number of very famous people who were actually notoriously bad leaders early on in their life, and then they saw the light. And one example is Franklin Roosevelt, who was a very arrogant, annoying person until he got polio. And then he became a really effective leader because all of a sudden he was forced to stop being a wealthy kind of a prick, if you'll pardon my language. You can edit that part out, Wayne. But instead of being, a really bad person, he became somebody who understood humiliation, understood pain, understood difficulty, and was able to empathize and sympathize. And now he was able to create relationships with people rather than being on top of them and thinking that he was, entitled to everything. He was really kind of a spoiled brat until he got polio, and that changed his whole ability to be a leader. So in my view, servant leadership consists really of two things. This is a big oversimplification, but it's about character and relationships. And this is sort of a problem maybe for servant leadership. I don't think in the country as a whole, character is a bad word. I will tell you that in the academic circles that I've traveled in, character is kind of a bad word these days. They don't talk about character. So nobody teaches character much in schools. And in fact, it's kind of poo-pooed as a thing, mostly because character, well, so what is character? Character is what you do when nobody is looking. And it's how you make choices. And that depends upon what are your values and how do you weigh things like, do I watch TV or do I go and do service for somebody who has a need? And those choices are values, and character, generally speaking, relies on values that are outside of yourself. And there are many people in academia these days who think that that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as any values that are universal. Again, I suspect Wayne may have a different perspective on this, because I can't believe you could be much of a minister if you think that values are things that everybody makes up for themselves. So I guess you could be a Unitarian minister. But anyway, characteristics. These are the guy named Larry Spears came up with these. These are the 10 characteristics of a servant leader: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and building community. We'll briefly look at each one of these independently. So listening, we talk here about active listening, not just passive. So you're not just sitting there, and hopefully all of you right now are active listening. You are taking what I'm saying and reflecting on it, wondering how it fits into your experience, and you're wondering if that's really true. You're testing it inside your heads. That's active listening. And you're really focused on trying to understand what I'm trying to say, rather than what you're going to say next, or what you're thinking about for after this program, or what you had for dinner, or anything like that. Another important part of this listening is it's 360 degrees, top to bottom. I'm guessing all of us have worked for somebody or known people who only listen to people who are their superiors, and not in the hierarchy, and not to people who they thought of as their inferiors. That doesn't work for servant leadership. And it's important to listen completely before making a decision. One of the things that I've learned the hard way is that when I've been in leadership positions, somebody presents a problem, and unfortunately, it's a human thing, I guess. I immediately start thinking about what I think this is about and how I'll respond. And what I've learned to do better is to ask questions first. And I would say in about 95% of the situations, what I thought was going on was not what was going on. And if I shut my mouth off based upon my early first impression thing, I'd really look stupid. And I really would have been really an awful person. So it's really important. I think listening is probably one of the most important characteristics of a servant leader, because you're trying to serve somebody else's needs. You have to realize your first priority is to understand their needs. Along those same lines, is there a question? Okay. Empathy, is to separate the person from their work and try to walk a mile in their shoes. Again, if you're trying to understand their needs, you need to see things from their perspective as best you can. Healing, you want to help your staff become whole and build a future together. So you don't want to have things where people are angry or mad or hurting about something. You want them to be on board. Awareness about yourself and about the organization. Also important, Greenleaf talks about being sharply awake and reasonably disturbed. I think is an interesting position to be in. Persuasion, again, you're not going to use power. You're not going to say those words that parents love to say, because I said so, but rather you're going to try to convince and build consensus quickly. One of the things you're probably picking up on right now is that servant leadership has as one of its key premises a respect for everybody who's involved in what you're doing. It's not a sense of I know better than you do. It's a sense that everybody is important, everybody matters, and that you are going to treat them that way, and you will deal with things no matter what your position is. You still care about everybody. Conceptualization is a really important part of leadership. It's one of the things, an important thing that gets a leader the idea of influence, because they're able to see things. And, I've had the privilege of working in several cases for people who understood what was going on. I worked for a guy who was amazing at this. He could see things at 30,000 feet that the rest of us never saw in terms of where things were going and how it worked. So he really had a great sense of what was going on. Of course, he was older than we were. He had more experience. He had seen more things, but it was really helpful. And I think if you look at most generals, for example, and admirals, what they bring to the table is their capacity to see the situation in a way that the individual soldier can't, because of where they occupy their position. They don't have enough, they haven't seen enough, and they're not operating at a high enough level and abstracting enough to see what matters. And it's up to the general to say, if we take that hill, or if we take that redoubt, that opens up the whole thing. Or if we seize that valley, or if we shut down that supply center. Recently saw the 3-part documentary on Grant, and it's amazing how often he had these insights, because he was brilliant about what things he had to do in order to shape a battle in a certain direction and how to make it work. It was not brute force. There was a lot of very smart, intelligent moves in the right place. You'll notice these abbreviations, BHAG and SMART. I don't know if you're familiar with them already. BHAG comes out of Jim Collins's work, Good to Great, other places. I was lucky enough to know him when I worked out in California. BHAG stands for Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal. And that's kind of the same idea as a transcendent purpose. You want to project something to everybody that says, here's the big time thing we're doing. So Wayne might talk to us about, serving New Hampshire in times of great need of a hurricane, and what is our goal to do these various things and make this work, so that we see a big picture and we see a very big purpose to what we're doing. It's not just it's not making money. Of course, in our case, wouldn't be true anyway. But but even for a company these days, especially, it seems like people don't really work for money, because they could be unemployed and do fairly well at unemployment. Sometimes they can do better, but because they really believe in what they're doing, and that's what the BHAG does. However, just because it's a BHAG doesn't mean you just give random abstract things. Your goals should also be SMART, so they should be specific and measurable, and they should be attainable and relevant and time-based. That's at least those are my words. I've seen several formulations for SMART, but that's one pretty decent one, I think. And the basic idea is to have the kind of plans that are concrete enough and are realistic enough that they really are decent plans and not just general expressions. I think it's important to make time for strategy. I would just warn against marrying a plan. Some very good people have died, have done badly or died because they got too connected to their plan and forgot to rethink things or change things. So it's really the thinking that counts. I think Eisenhower was a big believer. He said he hated plans, but he thought planning was essential. So it's the process of identifying things. But you sometimes find people who get their plan is like their Maginot Line at the end of World War I. It becomes their protection for everything. And we all know what happened to the Maginot Line at the beginning of World War II. And then foresight is that ability to see what the consequences are going to be from the present decisions, and be able to anticipate what's going to happen next and how this is going to work. More characteristics: stewardship. This is the idea that you have to think about yourself as a leader, that you're entrusted with the resources of others, you're entrusted with the care of those you are working with, and you ought to make sure there's a return on those investments. Commitment to the growth of people. James Hunter is one of my favorite authors in the area of servant leadership. He has a line that says, you're either alive and growing or you're dying, dead, or decaying. The point of that is you've got to keep changing, you've got to keep moving. If you're not alive and growing, you're actually dying. So there you go. And it shouldn't be just the growth of your favorite people in the organization, it's everybody. And this idea of building community. You want a more effective community, and you want to have this kind of camaraderie. By the way, that is the right way to spell it. I was not sure when I first thought of it, but I looked it up. That actually is the right way to spell it. And so ideally, we'd all like to have staffs of the people we work with in our counties or in our areas, and feel that sense of camaraderie, that we're a team. To most of you, by the way, all this looks a lot like the Patriot Way. No surprise. All right. But there are some paradoxes. As I said, servant leadership as a term is itself a paradox. How can you be a servant and a leader? Seems like that's a contradiction in terms. And the answer is, this is one of the hard parts, very hard parts about servant leadership, is there's always a balance. So here is a presentation of the balance of various things. I'll give you time to kind of look at that. I'll walk through this, kind of, at least most of this. So first of all, you want to be great enough to be without pride. The team gets the credit, you get the blame. I often loved watching Tom Brady get interviewed after a game because he did everything he could to give the credit to everybody else if they won. And when they lost, he would talk about how he didn't do a good job. Perfect example of this idea. Compassionate enough to discipline. You can't be soft. You have to set high expectations and follow through and yet still be compassionate. You have to be right enough to say, I'm wrong. The people who are insecure have a real hard time with this because they're afraid they ever say I'm wrong, you'll think that they are always wrong. But you have to understand leaders make mistakes. You have to admit you're human. And if you're really good, people don't hold it against you. They're actually pretty excited that you're able to admit that you're human too. You're wise enough to admit you don't know. And you're busy enough to listen. I think we all have worked with people who, or know people who say they're always busy. They're not leading, they're just being busy. They're managers, they're not leaders. And that's a problem. Here's the greatest paradox, I think, and that's leading enough to serve. You have to focus an organization. This is humble leadership. This is egoless leadership. You emphasize the role of others in your success. You accept responsibility for failures. You're constantly seeking ways to improve. You get involved yourself. You don't go to field day and sit in a tent or something and watch everybody else do stuff. You actually get out there and do things, and you stress what's best for the organization, not just a few people or yourself. That's the leading enough to serve. It's 360-degree support. You're supporting the people that you work with as well as the people with whom you work with going in the direction. You do listen to stakeholders. There's no job too big, no job too small. You participate, you listen, you build consensus to lead, not to manage. And I admit there's more, but we don't have infinite time. But this is a pretty good look at, you're already getting a flavor, I think, for what this is about. Let's see how this works in practice. So this is another kind of, I think, really important graphic, I think, to think about. Traditionally, we think about the structure as being there's a commander, and then there's management, and there's labor. And that's just rife with all kinds of categories and subordination. This kind of structure actually could make a lot of sense at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. A lot of your laborers didn't speak English, and they were treated basically as biological machines. And you thought of them as being interchangeable and not really being humans. It wasn't correct, but that's how people often thought back then. And if that's your attitude toward people, maybe this kind of military structure makes sense. It's ironic this is often referred to as being a military structure, because my observation has been that in many parts of the military, like the Marine Corps in particular, and others, this is really being abandoned pretty regularly at this point. General David McChrystal, retired now, but he wrote a whole book, and he talks about the inversion of expertise and how in today's military, it's the foot soldier who knows everything, knows what's going on, and also knows the equipment. It is much more advanced technologically than their officers who come from a different time period, and they wouldn't know how to program some of this stuff, or they would know how to use a PRC 160 radio, because they never had one, and it's got things on it that were never part of their life. And so you rely on your troops a lot, and you have to take a different position with them than it used to be in the old days when you did more than they did. They were just cannon fodder. Now they're incredibly expensive. The military spends hundreds of thousands of dollars training these people. They're very capable. They're at least high school graduates, but often better than that. And they've spent a lot of time getting good at what they do. The same is true in the operating room. Well, at one time, nurses were treated like just sort of functionaries, and they're just women. But now nurses are incredibly valuable and know a lot of important things. And as I understand it, in a surgical team, the doctor relies a lot on the expertise and the knowledge of the nurses who are part of that team. I, my Back in my prior days, long time ago, I'm a recovering lawyer. When I practiced in a law firm, we had legal assistants who knew a lot more about things than I did in a lot of areas. And you damn well better have treated them with respect and supported them because they knew more than you did about a lot of things that they were responsible for. You sometimes see organizations that are this first among equals, primus inter pares kind of things, but I really want to focus on the bottom part. In most people's minds today, an organization structure has the commander on top, staff in the middle, and the customers below. One of the metaphors I like a lot is that when you look at this structure, people tend to look up the organization chart, which means the staff is turning their rear ends to the customers in order to serve the commander. The servant leadership model is to flip the pyramid, the right-hand side. And it says, look, the customers are really on top, and your staff serves the customers, and your job as a leader is to serve the staff, to enable them, to empower them, to let them do their jobs. They know more what the customers want than you do. And so your job is to help get obstacles out of their way. There are other forms of leadership styles or names for them that have a similar kind of idea. There is a path goal theory that's popular, I think, in the Air Force in particular. There's a lot of the same kind of concepts. The role of the leader is not to be the guy who tells people what to do, but rather the guy who looks out and says, what does the staff need? How can I do the things that help them be effective? And I think we all know that Wayne does that with us all the time. He's constantly thinking about how can I make my ECs do their stuff and be more effective. He's not telling us what to do. He's saying, what do you need from me? What can I get for you? How can we make this work better? I think the only reason, by the way, Wayne asked me to do this is that he's a servant leader himself. In any event, team performance. The job description for a non-servant leader is to command and control. You don't trust the people. You got to boss them around, tell them what to do. It gets, the hiring manager writes the job description. In servant leadership, it's a mutual understanding. It's dynamic. It's reviewed annually. And the draft comes from the employee, not from the leader. Performance standards. Again, the servant leader approach is to meet my performance objectives this period, I must. The employee initiates and the supervisor reviews. So the only thing a servant leader has to make sure of is the staff doesn't take on too much. You often see people who have higher ambitions than they could possibly accomplish. So let me give you some examples. Here are some Fortune's 100 best companies to work for. A third of the top 35 are servant leadership companies. And these are examples. 10 of America's most admired companies, these are the 10, I think, I think they're actually 11, but whatever. These are among the most admired companies. These are all servant leadership based companies. Doesn't mean they're always successful. We have very difficult economic times, but I think everybody would say these are pretty admirable companies in how they do things and how they treat their people and how we feel about them. Here are some individuals. I know names because I'm sure hopefully you recognize all three of these folks. Here's some more individuals which you might not recognize. Herb Kelleher was he died recently, but was the founder of Southwest Airlines. Howard Bahar is the founder of Starbucks. Sam Walton, of course, Walmart. Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, and just a ton of other people for whom this is a big thing, and they've done a lot along these lines. So, actually, I'm doing much faster than I thought. Let's assume I've gotten you at least piqued your interest and you want some more information. By the way, one more thing about servant leadership that you may find surprising is that, the question to ask is, who in your organization can be a servant leader? How many servant leaders can you have? How many servant leaders could we have in ARES, for example? And so Wayne's probably going to tell me right now. Wayne, how many servant leaders could we have in ARES?
As many members as we have.
Exactly. Everybody can be a servant leader. Everybody can serve the needs of the others. That would be the ideal, actually. If everybody had that motivation and was that bought in and was seeing themselves as serving the needs of everybody else, we would have a fantastic organization. So there's not an idea of leaders and followers of castes or of only some people are eligible to be a leader. Everybody can be a leader in different scopes, of course. and that'll be the difference in terms of your responsibilities. But everybody can be a leader, and if you think about how things like the incident response system works, it sort of encompasses that idea that things break up into teams, and they're leaders of that, and they're leaders of the subpart, and everybody is there leading in their own particular way. As long as we keep it coordinated, that works really well. And that really needs to be the attitude everybody has. The one thing we have to fight is the idea of I only do what I'm told to do. I'm just a pound of flesh, and I'm just here to you tell me what you want. I don't know anything. I'm not engaged. That's the wrong thing for us. All right, well, let me assume that I haven't completely turned you off, and instead you're kind of interested in getting more deeply into this and getting a more comprehensive picture. This is my particular favorite book. There are a lot of books about servant leadership. This is the one that I find is really helpful. It's not expensive. As of today, it's about $12 on Amazon. It's not that long. It's a very small book, and it's got big type, lots of spaces. I usually refer to this as a 3-dump book because I can usually read it by sitting on the toilet 3 times when I have to go to the bathroom. So it's the kind of thing you can read on an airplane. It's sort of perfect for in the old days of travel. You're sitting at the gate. I guess we don't do that anymore. But in the old days of being at a gate, you read like half of it at one gate and half of it on your return flight, and you're pretty much done. But there's a lot of good stuff, and it's written as a story, so it's very, very readable. It's kind of hard to put down, actually. But it has a lot of great things in it, and it provides, I think, a very easy to remember because it's built around a narrative rather than being just somebody lecturing at you the whole time. So that's a book that I would very much would encourage you to. I use this book a lot with college students, and it fascinates me. In many, many cases, they read this book and they then buy more copies for their parents, and the parents buy a box of the books to give to the people at their jobs. I don't want to think about how many copies of this book I've directly purchased or caused to be purchased, but I really think this is an awesome book. There's a sequel called The Culture, but that's goes into some more other topics. It's a good book, but this would be the place I would suggest you start. So that's all I prepared. I hope that was enough. Didn't take 65 minutes. Geez, only 42. I'm on a roll. Guess I've been out of it for too long. But hopefully there's some more. We have plenty of time to talk about any questions or concerns anybody has. Or feel free to challenge me. I don't have all the answers, but I'd be happy to hear anybody's objections or any questions. Well,
It's a quiet group, Carey.
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
Well, digesting, it's a lot to
That's true.
think through. And of course, we're an older audience, so we're kind of used to some of the traditional paradigms, right? And we probably worked in one of those or lived in one of those environments. Maybe even our family environment was, like that. So it's something that has to, that stresses us. It's going to force us to rethink it. But what you presented, it is an ideal that we certainly do know about. And I think whenever we see people who are doing servant leadership, we say, that's the right way to do it. And as you said, I both through my military experience and my service in the ministry, that's what we were trained on was, you're there to serve others. In fact, when I got, when I was promoted to 06, before I was promoted to 06, when I was down at the chaplain school, someone said to me, one of the colonels there, full colonels there, said, our job as a colonel is to enable other folks. We're the ones, you said it almost exactly word for word the way he said it, was that we need to find ways to resource them so that they can reach their full potential with whatever project or vision they have, or whatever service they're doing. So they even see that at certain levels, it's absolutely critical that you enable folks through resourcing, whether that's physical resources or supporting them, having their back or whatever. And that's, that's what I am, like you said, if we were all doing that, if all of our members in their ways were servants, it would be an amazing organization. It is still a great organization.
I understand.
Um,
Yeah, I
it
agree.
is a great organization, and there's a lot of great servant leaders out there. Every time I go around to these, unfortunately not this year, field day stops, when we go out to see folks working, when we go to the academies, we're just doing one-on-one with folks to see how much people do, um, finding out what people's needs are, and then making it happen for them.
The whole tradition of the Elmer in amateur radio
That's right. That's a good.
is another example of this kind of, unless you've got an Elmer who somehow is trying to exert power over somebody. But I think that's pretty rare. I think it's really, I remember when I first got licensed, I had a problem with a transmitter, and the guy who was the founder of a very large law firm in DC that my dad was a partner in, who was also a ham, spent an entire Saturday going through my transmitter with me and showing me things and showing me how to diagnose things. And this guy was, I mean, he billed out at, even back then, at hundreds of dollars an hour, and his name was in the law firm. And nonetheless, he treated me with respect, and he wanted me to learn these things. And he really thought it was important to the hobby that somebody at the age of 13 could, grow into the hobby and go somewhere. And maybe I never thought about it till right now, but in some ways, maybe I'm kind of repaying that debt from the little I do. Maybe that's exactly what he had in mind, if I would become somebody who might. But that's not only the part of debt. It's just more that his idea was that he was there to serve the needs of others. It was also part of the way he practiced law. He was the same way. He was there to solve his clients' problems, not to be a boss of his clients or not to tell them what to do. He would enable them to get past their problems.
Yeah. So, folks that are on tonight, think about someone that that truly, not these, so-called famous people that, Carey described, but someone personally that that you say, boy, that really closely models what, we were talking about today, and how they were able to provide something for either you or someone that you knew about, that they really needed. And then they were able to enable them to reach their, full potential.
And I would say when you do that, be sure you recognize them. I don't mean reward them. You have to give them something for free or things like that. Just make sure other people hear that story. And I think that could help inspire other people to do the same thing, because they would see how that's something that's respected and is appreciated. So it's one of the things we can also do as in our positions, is that we can recognize people and encourage their heart and show them that what they're doing is actually thought about and is respected. I think we all belong to clubs where it's unfortunate, but it tends to be that a small group of people do a very high percentage of the work. And, and then nobody actually really, you don't think about it anymore. We take it for granted almost. And they're kind of, they do it for whatever reason, but I don't know if we always recognize as much as we should how much they're doing and how awesome they are for taking on this responsibility and taking care of this. So I think that's another thing we often do, is we forget to, as I say, it's not even a matter, I guess it's sort of thanked, but it's more just people knowing this is what somebody did. It doesn't usually often doesn't even end up in the reports about like field day, that this person came early and set things up, or this person gave up their afternoon to make sure the antenna was working, things like that, or to get the van set up or whatever had to be done. But those are the kind of things we'd like to, I think, celebrate and cause other people to know about, so that they might think of following that example, because that would be great. I don't know what else to, I mean, if nobody else wants to say. I guess it is such a bad job, nobody has questions. But anyway, that's how I interpret it.
I'll edit that part out.
Okay. I mean, also, does anybody want to chime in about something from their own experience and say I've seen this too, or I agree with this, or this is what I've tried to do?
WA1EYF.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was in scouting as an adult volunteer for 20 years. And one of the things I did was I headed up, I was council commissioner. So I headed up about almost 50 people who served the 800 volunteers that we had in our council. And the one thing I did is every year at the recognition banquet, what I would do was I would always start out by telling them that, you know, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole here, and you guys that are, and ladies who are out with the units, you're at the top, and that is my job to serve you. So if you need anything, please come to me and I'll go out and I'll help you, because that's my job. And that's kind of the approach that I always took. And boy, I'll tell you, that really worked well.
Great, perfect. That says it all. You should have done this. Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, I think if those of us who played team sports, you know that it's not about the championships, it's not about the points, it's about the other guy, the other people on your team, that camaraderie where you serve their needs and you block for them. I'm always amazed how in some teams, how even very marquee level players are willing to block for somebody else and make them look good and put their own bodies at risk because they're committed to each other and to the team. That's a great sign. At the same time, I've seen plenty of professional teams with hotshot people, and they don't do it. They don't win anything because each one is just selfishly thinking about themselves. I won't name any basketball players currently who seem to have that characteristic, but nonetheless, well, I think a very big difference was, at least when they won their championship, the Golden Gate Warriors, both Steph and KD were also pretty amazing about their willingness to pass to each other and to do various things to make the other person look good, rather than being stuck up and trying to just be good themselves. It led to some great results. It also was a great role model.
Yeah, Carey, this is Al Stone, KB8RPO.
Hello, sir.
Just want to comment, I thought it was a very good presentation. Looking back to my work history, I can relate to some of that, and it brought back some memories and thoughts of things that went on in my work life. So again, I appreciate the presentation, and looking forward for the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you for being here. By the way, I found this applies not just to work, but it applies to all relationships, with friends, with girlfriends, I haven't had a wife, but I think it applies to marriage as well. So I think this is the kind of thing that creates better relationships. So with your children, same kind of an idea. So it's not unique to employment. It applies to anything where you want to have a stronger relationship, which I think we all want to have. That's a natural human thing. Aristotle said that man is by nature a social being. And I think one of the things we crave is to have a better social relationship. That's been brought home to us during this pandemic. As we've been forced to be separated, we now recognize even more than ever how much we depend on interacting with other people. So this is the kind of approach, it's not rocket science. It's just the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. It's really what it boils down to. I can't think of anything more complex to say than that. And again, I think that's why it resonates, because that particular doctrine is in every major religion that I'm familiar with. I think it's all over the place. It just seems to make common sense.
Yeah, Carey, Al again. I was relating back to not just my work life, but I also was a volunteer fireman, and I was a police officer and deputy sheriff, and a lot of that, I had the goods and the bads over my time period, and it really stood out. So again, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service. That's you've done a lot of great things, and still are doing great things. But that's a lot of nice stuff that you've been involved with. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, of course, you're all in this. You're in this session because you're staff, and in this particular one about leadership because you, at the heart of it, understand this idea of servant leadership. I will give you one challenge, and that is, think of, you'll have a chance to take a look at the video, down the road here, and good presentation, especially to the PowerPoint here. Go back and take a look at those. Select out an item there, and use that as an incentive to. I'm not going to use the word incentive because Carey didn't like that word.
The motivation, how's that sound?
The motivation, yes. To try something.
Good point.
Yeah, to kind of grow yourself as a leader. How's that?
Perfect.
And those who you work with. So find something within the presentation to bring back to your local group or your particular area of leadership, and implement it. So that'd be my challenge. I also appreciate the presentation, Carey, and we're glad we were able to get it in here with the group. And as the video is played, others will also get to look at it. And I'm glad I answered the question right. You asked me, how many leaders do we have? Because when I share this out to everybody, then everybody has a chance to learn about servant leadership, and they can all, because they're all leaders.
I will also offer, it's also sort of a warning, as you can probably tell, I'm somewhat fanatic about this, but I'd be more than happy to get emails or calls or something from anyone who would like to have a more private conversation or has questions or reservations or whatever.